Overall, my palette doesn't really change. It stays consistent throughout the years. For the most part, once in a while I change something up, and I'll talk about that. So titanium white, you can get that from just about any company. Any of the professional paints are really good quality. I prefer Gamblin or Utrecht for the most part, and some of RGH, the colors from RGH paints. But I could probably stick with Gamblin and get all of my colors just from them. Really good company. And I love that I can get the 150 ml tubes from them. That's really the reason why I've gone with them for the last 30 years. So my palette consists of, for the most part, a split of the different color groups. A warm and a cool of each of those. Or in this case, I should say a cool and a warm, because that's the order I'll be going in with these. These are the brushes that I use consistently. These are my major brush styles and categories. I recently purchased the Rosemary & Company Ivory Long Flats because Utrecht stopped carrying the 207 flats. So far, they seem to be a beautiful brush. I will keep you informed. This barn is about 10 miles from my home. I pass it all the time on my way to the Castle Gallery in Fort Wayne, and I have admired it for years. I just love all the character, everything about it. I was excited to have the opportunity to paint this with the group. If you hear any strange warbles in my voice or in some of the words, or a sudden crackling or whatever, we're having a thunderstorm here today, and so that lightning is giving me some periodic blips in the voiceover. Sorry about that. So here's a final version of the painting, the photo of it, and I thought you might like to see some details, some close-ups of the different areas in there, since the video doesn't necessarily hone in right in on some of those little spots. You can see some of the texture and brushwork in there. All right, have fun with the video. I grabbed a bit of walnut oil there so I can get my paint a little bit more fluid, get some washes on the panel. These lavenders that I'm putting into the barn right now, I'm mixing those piles constantly to change up the color temperature from warmer to cooler. So I started off with using some of that blue-black that I talked about that's already a little bit of a toned down blue. And I mixed that with some of the quinacridone red and some white to create that grayed down lavender. I don't want it to be a real strong lavender at the moment. I'm just getting the overall beginning feeling of that textural quality, that weathered look in that barn. But at the same time, I want to have a mixture going on. So I take some of that lavender and mix it or give it a little bit more warmth to it. So I change up, even within a structure like a tree or in this case the barn, I'm constantly changing up here and there the color temperature from warm to cool. I want to have that juxtaposition or that play with each other of warm and cool colors next to one another, because that really helps to liven up the painting a lot. It livens up those spaces. So with the lavenders that I'm putting into the barn, that just comes from that toning down that lavender by getting more of the yellows into it. So I use some of the piles that are already there to help tone down those lavenders. Now these little windows, those are where often when we first start painting, we'll have a tendency to see those as very distinct geometric shapes. They're squares, and we want to put them in as squares with all these 4 sharp lines and edges to them. And that is not what I see when I look at that. So I'm going to let the atmosphere have a lot of sway in those structures. So the atmosphere, all that haze in the air, is going to soften out a lot of those edges, and the weathering of that barn is going to soften those out. And it's just a lot more interesting to take those and break up the dark square spaces that are there that create those windows. So coming in with strong sharp edges, that's just going to create a very stiff feeling to the structure. And if you notice, when I get some paint on my brush, I'll pull that down and kind of lift as I go, and it leaves a much less paint towards the bottom of that. So it changes up the opaqueness of the color, or of the shadow shape, the dark shape that creates each of those windows. And that's how I can get some of that variety in that shape. I can also come in after with some other colors and things, but I like the broken paint, that dry brush broken texture of that stroke. lot of what I'm doing now is tightening up my drawing. So when I first started this, it was pretty fast and fluid and a little bit out of control. Now I'm coming back in and tidying up the drawing. And for some people, they think that that's just a waste of time. If I had paid more closer attention to my drawing in the beginning, it would have saved me the time of coming back in and cleaning it up. But it's a lot more fun for me when I just take off with it sometimes and don't worry about it, because I know that I can come in and fix it. I can come in and change it. But it's a lot of that at the beginning when I'm just going fast and furious and kind of sloshing things around. Much of that is the intuitive part. It helps me to start my painting off right from the beginning in an intuitive manner rather than in an academic manner. And I feel that for me, it helps my paintings to have a much more natural, spontaneous, and serendipitous feeling to it, a joy to it that I wouldn't have otherwise. If I worried about the drawing too much in the very beginning, for me, I find that it stiffens me up, and I get too caught up in worrying about whether I'm getting off on something. I don't want to disrupt the drawing of it, sort of thing, and so I get concerned then, and I don't have some of those fun, fluid brush strokes and texture in there that I get when I'm not worried about that. So everyone has to find their own way of doing things with art. For some, that way just would be frustrating for them and wouldn't work, and so those individuals wouldn't want to paint that way. But it's experimentation. It's just playing with it and being open to the experience, being open to whatever it is that might work that we wouldn't have necessarily anticipated in the beginning. So here I'm trying to create those textures in that barn. I love all that. I mean, that's really what drew me to that barn, is all that weathered texture. It's so fascinating. Seeing all the different colors as little bits of paint peel off of there, and you get the wood. That wood isn't just one constant color throughout. Each plank of wood has a little bit different variation of color to it. So as the paint starts to weather off of there and the wood weathers, some of the wood turns kind of a bluish gray tone to it, like a charcoal. Some of it turns a reddish brown. There's just so many different colors in there and different textures that's a lot of what I'm trying to capture now, just by really it's a real soft, dry brush stroke where I'm just capturing the end of those bristles on there and dragging them, or placing the brush, just touching the brush to the panel and then lifting the brush off so that it's soft enough that it just catches the tips of the bristles. And so it's not a whole opaque push down with the brush and leave an opaque stroke there. It's just those little bristles that are there, and it's just broken paint on top of other broken paint to help create that feeling of weatheredness with the barn. So you can see it really wasn't that complicated to go and put that outcropping, even though I didn't account for it in the beginning of my painting with all of my fluid brushwork there in the beginning. It still wasn't that complicated to come back in and put that outcropping in there. But I did have to be a little bit more discerning or careful about what I was doing to accomplish that. So that's when I slow down a bit. I analyze more closely my reference material and just how that structure is formed. But more importantly, I'm not looking at it as, okay, I've got to make this outcropping. I'm looking at it as, here's a series of shapes. And how do those shapes, how are they formed in relation to a shape next to it? So like in this case, I looked at the shapes of like a triangle here, this little triangle shape on the side of that structure. How big is that triangle shape? And what is it like in relation to the barn overall, or to that outcropping? What is that shape's size and form in relation to the shapes that make up that outcropping? And that's how I draw. That's how I don't work with thinking about the line so much when I'm painting on location, especially. I'm thinking more in terms of shape and relative proportion and relative placement as far as the shapes that are around it. And that helps me then to get a much more natural feeling, I think, than when I'm really concerned about painting within the lines. I've never been much for the comic book thing of painting in the lines. Or sorry, coloring book, not comic book. So in terms of that, those little triangle shapes, I know that there's going to be one on each side of that painting, or each side of that outcropping, and the one that's going to be on the left is going to be a little bit smaller than the one on the right because it is going farther away from us. It's a little bit different angle, but it's still, they're going to be relatively proportional to one another because that outcropping is in the middle of that barn space right there. So that's what I'm paying attention to rather than the actual lines that make up that outcropping. I'm paying more attention to the spaces, the planes. So there's a plane on the very front facing us of that outcropping with the window on it. There's a plane on the side of it that's a wall that catches the light. And how big is that plane on the side of it in relation to the plane on the front of it that's facing us, the plane that's in the shadows? How is that in relation to the plane of the roof that's on top of that outcropping? All of those, I'm looking at the relative size relationships of each of those different shapes and how they relate to one another. And that helps me then to make sure that those shapes are proportionally correct. Not so that I know architecturally it's going to necessarily stand up all the time, but so that as far as how it feels to the viewer, everything feels proportionally correct. That helps my drawing actually to go a little bit faster, I think, than if I just tried to lay in lines and get it exactly right and then paint within those lines. So you notice when I'm putting in when I'm building out these windows and things, at first I put in a window molding that was way too bright. It sort of stood out like a neon flashing sign or something in there. And that's because I was looking at the picture right off and seeing how bright it was compared to the darkness of the window, the opening in the window. That's when, especially when we're out on location, but even when we're working from photographs, we have to think more clearly about it. And especially, we need to squint. So if I take that window molding and I compare it to something else that's bright in the painting, like the fence post that's out there on the side of the barn that's in full light, it's in full sunlight, it's nice and bright. If I take the window molding that looks bright because it's bright in comparison with the darkness of the window opening, if I take the brightness of that molding and I squint down and I really judge it relative to that fence post, I'll realize that it's not nearly as bright as what it looks like when I first look at it with my eyes wide open. That's why squinting, it is critical if we want to get accurate value relationships in our painting. Squinting, it's one of our best tools that we have as artists to figure out our values. There are a lot of little tools out there I've seen. You can even get apps now, I think, to help you figure out the values. But if we just squint all the time and practice that over and over, we're not going to need any tool. A tool will usually just slow us down. And when we're out on location trying to capture a fleeting moment, we want to utilize our time very well. So squint all the time. So in putting in this warm foliage, this warmer, relative, when I say warmer, it's relatively warmer foliage compared to a lot of the blue-greens that I have in those trees. So putting that warm foliage right behind that part of the roof right there is a fun way to have those warm and cool colors playing against each other. So even though the roof panels have that red in the white mixed into that white, there's so much white there that it makes that color cooler. It's more closer to the lavender side of things, so it's cooled that color down quite a bit. So putting the warmer reddish brown and yellow tones in that foliage really gives it a nice dynamic, stimulating effect when I place that next to the lavenders in that roof. So that's part of what I'm referring to when I'm talking about warm and cool, warm and cool. It doesn't have to be within the specific space that we're working with. It could be two spaces placed next to each other where one is warmer and one is cooler. And in this case, the foliage is one space that's warmer and the roof panel is a space that's cooler. Now it's time for me to come in and really start to flesh out all the plants and foliage all around the barn. So I decided I wanted that dusty road going in there, an old farm looking road, not all nice and sharp lines like we'd have out on the highway, but something that really feels like tractors and horses and other things have trod that road. And that it's a bit neglected, just like the barn itself. It hasn't been taken care of. To me, that's a lot more interesting looking than when it's all nicely cultured. These plants that I'm putting in, they don't have to necessarily look like anything in particular. They just have to have some good form and structure to them as far as light and dark and three-dimensional elements to it. And the same thing, so in each of the areas that I'm working on, I'm still thinking about my light source. What direction is the light coming? And that helps me then to know how to put in my light and shadow patterns in there. So with the road, I don't just put in a bright road. I have to think about some areas are going to have some shadows to it where the light's not hitting there, and other areas are going to be brighter. Some areas are going to be a little bit darker, but not too dark. All of that goes into thinking about how to create the feeling of naturalism in it. Otherwise, it's just a matter of, to a lot of these little spaces, it's coming in and just putting in little touches here and there. Not dramatic things, just little things that help to break up some of the color spaces that are there, to give the feeling of weeds sticking up, blades of grass, anything that might help to break up some of those planes, like the side of the barn, that whole big lavender plane, coming in with something that can break that up. So a little spot of blade of grass or a weed that is brighter in value can help then to start pulling things. It's that idea of overlap. So we can use overlap to help create the feeling of distance as well. So I can start pushing the barn back a little bit and bringing the foliage forward by having some little bits of blades of grass, just little minute things, little subtle nuances that help start pulling the foliage forward closer to us and making sure that we know that that foliage is in front of the barn and that they're not both on the same plane with each other. So in putting in highlights, especially on like the tree, that bush there off to the right side, bushy tree is really what it is. I have to keep in mind all the time my value relationships. So if I get my highlights on those trees too bright, then it's going to take away from the brightness in like the road that's there, some of the feeling of the field paths and things that are behind the tree, and then they become confused and we don't know what's what. So I want the highlights on the trees to feel like they're in the light, but not so bright that they confuse the viewer as to being as bright as what I might have on one of the lower planes. And that the warmth in those highlighted areas of that bushy tree too, you can really see the contrast between the warmth in that foliage, in that green, relative to the coolness of the field back behind it. That really helps to set off that field back there as being much farther away from us. It really accents contrasts against the coolness of that field back there. I don't really see much more that I need to do to this painting. Maybe little things, so I give it a bit to look at it afterwards, but I might as well go and put my signature in there because from what I can tell right now, it's finished. I like what I've got here. It is what I wanted to capture about that barn. I've got all the essentials in there. I've got the feeling, that dusty, bright, hazy day feeling to it. And so I like the way this one has come out. I have achieved what I hoped to achieve when I started this painting. That doesn't always happen. I'm glad it did in this case. And I hope that in watching this, that you gained a lot of insight into how to approach some of these situations yourself. I know each one of us, especially the more we paint, we're going to get little things that we do that are different from other artists. I haven't seen any two professional artists that paint exactly the same way. We're all different. We have different personalities, different experiences, and different interests as well. We might see a lot of beauty in the same subjects and in the same situations, but it doesn't mean that we see that beauty exactly the same way that another artist sees that beauty, or the way any other individual might see that beauty. So that's what makes art such a wonderful opportunity for us. We can very much be individuals. So get out there and be an individual and just love this opportunity we have to create something beautiful.